Sacrifice by Sekiraku. Chapter 1, The Vampire. "Oh, yes, Annie, just like that," Marcus groaned, his rough fingers tangling in Antony's hair. Antony rolled his eyes at the nickname, but didn't pause in his sucking. His second-in-command had been right. It really had been too long since they had dallied like this. He was enjoying himself much more than he'd expected. He slipped a hand between Marcus's legs and gave his balls a light squeeze. At the same moment, he drove forward and swallowed his cock down to the root, humming lightly as he relaxed his throat. This move always undid Marcus, and today was no exception. The other vampire came with a shout, pulling painfully at Antony's hair. Antony kept sucking through his orgasm, then subsided and simply held Marcus's cock in his mouth, waiting for his war chief to recover. Why didn't he take time for this more often? It had been almost a week. It wasn't as if his nights were full to bursting, like they had been back when their seafaring lives began over 1,000 years ago. Back then, only a few of his 50 followers had known the first thing about sailing, and fewer had known anything about organized fighting. He'd spent every waking minute either with Theodora, teaching spoiled vampires how to use their soft fingers to tie knots and trim sails, or with Marcus, whipping them into an approximation of a proper fighting force. There had been constant brawls as everyone grew used to their new cramped living situation, and more often than not there had been terrible, gnawing hunger that ground at the pit of his belly until he felt hollow. There had been so many days when Antony had lain awake in his bed, too exhausted even to sleep, wondering if it might not be better to step out into the sunlight and let it all just stop. But then they discovered that wide desert continent, completely unknown to the powers back in their own distant homeland, and full of warring tribes desperately scrabbling for the bits of arable land near the coast, and Claudia had devised her plan. After that, things had fallen into place. No more hunger meant less infighting, and the simple passage of time honed his pampered rabble into the finest fighters, sailors, and shipwrights Antony could have wished for. His direct leadership was rarely required anymore, and had he wished, he could have devoted all his time to his many hobbies: music, painting, sex. Sex with Marcus, preferably. They were far from monogamous. In a crew of 30, over the course of 1,000 years, everyone who was even the slightest bit interested in sex had sampled everyone at least once or twice. But he and Marcus had been each other's best and most regular fucks since shortly after their exile, and Antony, at least, intended to continue that arrangement until the end of time. Most particularly and urgently, right now. He moved off of Marcus's cock and squirmed up onto his bed, moving aside the lewdly sprawling form of his war chief. Antony wasn't large, but next to Marcus he sometimes felt like a child. The other vampire's body was long and wide, covered in tightly corded muscle, thick, dark hair, and a patchwork of scars. Lying sprawled and sated like this, he reminded Antony of the massive bears in their long-ago homeland after a meal. It still sent a little flame of satisfaction flickering in the deep parts of his belly to know that all of that skill and power lay at his command. "All right, my turn," he told Marcus. The bigger vampire grinned lazily up at him. "What if I've had enough?" Antony snorted. "You? Unlikely." "All right, then. What if I want to save my ardor for my new human plaything?" Marcus gave a languid stretch, showing no inclination to move. "We'll be arriving tonight, after all." "Yes, and spending 2 nights after our arrival making nice with the priests and royals." Antony shoved again at the other vampire's bulk. "You'll have plenty of time to let your ardor build before you're even choosing your human, let alone fucking him." I can hardly wait," Marcus purred, and Antony gave an exaggerated shudder. "I don't know how you can stand it," he grumbled. "They're all so soft and weak. It would be like sticking it in a jelly. And anyhow, they're humans. It's hardly a step above fucking a pig or a cow, like admitting you couldn't do any better. And who knows where they've been? It's filthy." "Oh, don't like filth, do you?" Finally, Marcus was moving. He reached across Antony's body to the drawer where the oils were kept, stooping down until his lips dragged over Antony's ear when he whispered, "Are you getting squeamish, my lord, after all these years?" The touch went straight to Antony's cock, but he kept himself in check and even managed to roll his eyes. "Just make sure to wash before coming to me," he said. "If you come in here with the smell of your toy on you, I'll dump you over the side. It will take Cloelia an hour to fish you out, and by then a shark might snap you. Oh!" His words cut off as Marcus wrapped an oil-drenched hand around his length. His war chief grinned smugly at the response and squeezed harder. "Oh, come now, Annie," he said, low and throaty enough to drive Antony mad. "Just think what fun we could have if you'd learn to be a little less prudish. We could swap our humans, sit and chat while they sucked us off, make them play with each other, maybe grab one of them and get him on all fours, and I could push into his mouth while you take the other hole." He'd been stroking Antony and shifting over him as he spoke. At this point, Marcus scooted up the length of Antony's body and positioned himself over the head of the smaller vampire's cock. Before he could say any more, Antony pressed a hand to his chest. "Wait, you idiot! You're not loosened! You'll hurt yourself!" Marcus grinned wolfishly, and though Antony had had 1,000 years to get used to every expression of his war chief's face, he still felt a delicious thrill shiver through his entire body. "Isn't that what you hate about humans? How breakable they are? I'm no human, Annie." And Marcus pressed down, engulfing Antony in one quick motion. Both vampires cried out, almost loudly enough to drown out the rather tentative knock at the door of Antony's quarters. Antony gripped Marcus's hips hard, keeping him in place while he gathered himself. "What?" he called out, his voice a ragged snarl. Unfortunately, it verged on a squeak at the end, when Marcus gave him a fiendish grin and an impish squeeze. "Forgive me, my lord." It was one of the human attendants left over from a previous sacrifice, and he sounded exactly as terrified as he ought to be. "My lord Theodora wanted me to tell you that she sighted the Titian harbor. Will arrive in about an hour." Oh, he was one of Theodora's. Good thing Antony hadn't given in to his first impulse, which had been to shove Marcus away and bellow at the intruder until he pissed himself. Theodora was miserly about her sacrifices. A hoarder, really. She must have had 6 cluttering up her chambers. She never slipped and broke them or drank them dry the way the others did. Instead, she kept them close until they finally keeled over of old age. Still, they were hers, and she was entitled to do with them as she pleased, and it would have been horrendously rude of him to damage one. "Tell your master you've delivered your message," he growled. "Now leave me be!" There was a sound of scurrying footsteps, and Antony returned his attention to the big vampire grinning on his cock. "Really?" he demanded. "That's what you can't wait to get your hands on?" Marcus rolled his eyes. "Theo lets them get old and shriveled and cowardly. I wouldn't touch one like that." "You could stand to be a little more like Theodora, you know," Antony said. Perhaps this wasn't the most inopportune time for a scolding, but the chance had presented itself. "Remember, you have to make them last 6 years. If you break this one, I'm not letting you pick another. You'll have to drink from the communal stock like everyone else." "Oh, really?" Marcus quirked an eyebrow, then began rolling his hips in shallow, fluid little movements that made Antony see stars. "What if I was really very sorry? What if I was willing to do anything to make it up to you? What—" The bigger vampire's voice cut off as Antony seized his hips and brought him down, hard. If he had only an hour until they arrived, he intended to make the most of it.